coming up from California, I believe, and that's where he began to have his associations with NNU and Darrell Bruner, whom he calls Carl. And I haven't gotten Darrell to tell me that story yet, but maybe we will sometime. Judge Burns serves as a United States District Judge Court in San Diego, California. Appointed by President George W. Bush, he was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate in September 2003. Before his appointment as a district judge, he was a United States magistrate judge for 6 years. As a magistrate judge, he helped negotiate settlements in hundreds of civil lawsuits and was named Judge of the Year by the Consumer Trial Lawyers of San Diego in 2002. Judge Burns was a trial lawyer from 1979 through 1997, first with the District Attorney's Office and later with the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Diego. He tried more than 150 cases to jury verdicts and argued more than 40 cases before state and federal court of appeals. He is a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and an associate of the American Board of Trial Advocates. He has published numerous legal articles and opinions, and he is the co-author of the Ninth Circuit Criminal Handbook, a digest of federal criminal law and procedure in 9 Western states. An alumnus of Point Loma Nazarene University, Judge Burns received his bachelor's degree in English and speech from Point Loma in 1976 and earned his Juris Doctorate in 1979 from the University of San Diego School of Law. And as I mentioned, he attended what was then Northwest Nazarene College from 1972 to 1974. And currently, he is a member of the President's Advisory Committee and the President's Community Council at Point Loma Nazarene University. I think it was back in January or February when Darrell approached me about the prospect of bringing Judge Burns to campus, which obviously I thought was a great idea. We don't normally get too many federal judges traipsing through here on a regular basis. Plus, I thought, that name rings a bell. That name, Larry Allen Burns, rings a bell for a reason. And then I remembered, yes, the tragic shooting in Tucson, Arizona, where Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was injured, where unfortunately, a good handful of people were killed, one of whom was the chief federal judge for Arizona, who was a good friend of Judge Burns's. And Judge Burns was then asked by the chief judge for the Ninth Circuit, Judge Alex Kaczynski, to preside over the trial of Jared Lochner. In reading about that recently, I came across some comments from Judge Kaczynski about Judge Burns. And he said, for example, "We don't have that many judges who have been involved in potential capital cases." He said, and I'm quoting Judge Kaczynski, that Judge Burns' experience with federal death penalty cases was an important consideration in his selecting Judge Burns. Judge Kaczynski also is quoted as saying that the ideal candidate to preside over this case was a combination of a general and a traffic cop. I also did some further research on Judge Burns, and it's amazing what people who have practiced before him, who have worked with him, say about him. Accolades such as efficient, fair-minded, extremely bright, and so on. It almost sounds like something a mother would write about their favorite child. So I'm extremely glad to be able to introduce to you this evening Judge Larry Burns.
It actually was my mom. She's on all of those. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. It's just a delight to be back. President Alexander and Vice President Pearsall, I want to thank you for inviting me and thank all of you who've come to hear what I have to say tonight. I want to also acknowledge my friend Darrell Bruner and another friend of mine who showed up tonight, and I'm delighted he's here, Saga Dick White. Darrell and I began as freshmen here in 1972, and although I was only here for 2 years, we we established a bond between us that lasted well beyond college and goes on to today. He has remained a good friend of mine over the years, and he's committed himself to serving Christ and serving his alma mater, and I'm proud to be his friend. Dick White is also here. I talked to him earlier. Where are you, Dick? Oh, okay. And I'm especially appreciative of that Dick and his wife have made it. Hundreds of college kids have been able to complete college here because Dick White gave them a job. And I count myself in that number. My parents were not wealthy. I had to work to stay in college, and Dick gave me a job when I first arrived. And I had that job. I held it for 2 years, and he made it possible for me to stay in school. And I very much appreciate that, Dick. I've told you that before, but I want to publicly acknowledge that. If you know Dick, you're familiar with his unmistakable laugh. Does that sound like Dick? More important, Dick has a big heart, and I'm very, very grateful that you have shown up tonight. When I first arrived here on campus in 1972, I just turned 18 years old. And in those days, I had a stock of dark hair and only a single chin. Karcher Mall was brand new, and there was no such place as the Idaho Center. The town of Meridian was a cow patch that separated Nampa from Boise. I don't know, maybe it still is. As I settled into Chapman Hall, which was then the freshman men's dorm, I took note of how so many of my fellow residents were tucking their white T-shirts into their jockey white underwear, something that I hadn't done since I was about 5 years old. It was a different place. It was a different era. I had no idea what I wanted to do in my life when I arrived here. I had no idea what I wanted to be or where my Northwest adventure might lead me. But I was happy to be in college, and in particular, I was happy to be here at NNU, what was then NNC. I had grown up in a Nazarene community. I lived on Brazee Avenue. Those of you that are familiar with the area, the predecessor to Point Loma College was this place called Pasadena College, and it was at the top of Brazee Avenue. And I lived about 8 houses down the street from that Nazarene College. The president of Pasadena College at the time was Shelburne Brown, and he lived 3 houses down the street. The dean was a man named Paul Gresham, and he lived 3 houses up the street. Nazarenes were everywhere on Brazee Avenue. So growing up, I knew, at least was pretty sure, that I was going to attend a Nazarene college. What I didn't anticipate was that it would be a Nazarene college 800 miles away. But once I got here, it didn't take me long to appreciate that NNC was where I was supposed to be. It was where I belonged. It was a place I found where I was challenged in the classroom, and I was cared for outside the classroom. Here in the various campuses, classrooms on this campus, including this very classroom, I don't think I've been here in 40 years, but I took a science class here. But in these very classrooms, I learned skills that would prove crucial to me later in my chosen profession of law. I learned how to think analytically. I learned how to write clearly and succinctly. And I learned how to speak persuasively. Here at NNC, both inside class and out of it, I interacted daily with committed Christians, Christian professors, Christian administrators, staff, and students who cared for me as a person and who encouraged me. It was here in classrooms and in chapel and in the dorms, in the cafeteria, at meals, and at other places at other times on this campus where the cornerstone, I believe, was laid for the later successes that I would achieve in my life. And I don't mean just in my professional life. I mean also as a husband and as a father. In his now famous address to the 2005 graduating class at Stanford University, Steve Jobs talked about connecting the dots. Of course, it's impossible to connect the dots looking forward, Jobs told the graduating class. But it becomes very, very clear why certain things happen, why certain events take place in your life as you look backward. Jobs' words to that graduating class ring true for me. As I came to later understand, God had a purpose for me here in Nampa. And the 2 years that I spent here would shape me, they would help me to grow up, and they'd otherwise influence my life in countless ways that I couldn't realize at the time. I came to understand from my time here and from graduating from a Nazarene college that I didn't have to attend an Ivy League university, or for that matter, any bigger or better known university, in order to succeed in my profession and in my life. The skills and the values and the lessons that were instilled here were the foundation for everything that I would later accomplish. Over the past 40 years now, I've discovered that a Christian college education invariably grows in value. You can count on it. In so many instances, it has been my Christian education that has proved to be the instrument for opening doors for me, doors of opportunity, providing a frame of reference for handling different situations and difficult situations and challenges that come in life. My Christian education gave me the ability to see beyond the limits that are set by a secular culture, beyond things that are merely scientific and modern ways of thinking, and instead to look to spiritual truths that are endowed by our Creator. This, in my opinion, is the real value that NNU and other Christian colleges offer. And for those of you who are fortunate to be here now, this is what you can expect when you graduate. Many things have changed in the 40 years since I first came here. We've got a new president, new facilities, nice new buildings, new students, generally a greatly expanded curriculum over what was available when I was a student. But there's at least one thing that hasn't changed. NNU has not deviated from its essential educational mission in all that time, which is to transform the whole person, to instill habits of heart, soul, and mind and strength in each student to become God's creative and redemptive agent in the world. Maybe more simply put, NNU strives to produce students who have acquired the skills to accomplish great things in the world, and it inspires them to touch the future and to make it better. So, with those things said, I am again very happy to be here tonight. Let me move to the question that I've been asked to talk to you briefly about and to address in the main part of my talk to you tonight. Professor Shaw, along with Darrell, invited me to campus, has asked me to comment about my experience as a judge, and more particularly about the intersection between faith and the law. It's a subject that, as you can imagine, I think about frequently. Issues come up frequently that cause me to examine both my faith and my obligation as a judge to follow the law, to be faithful to the oath that I took to do so. And from time to time, I have had to navigate as someone who is both a Christian and a judge. Here in the United States, we have a guarantee of justice. It's above the main Justice Building in Washington, D.C. It adorns our courts. And the slogan is this: equal justice under law. That guarantee of equal justice under law rests principally on a concept that we call the rule of law. And the rule of law refers to a rule that means every citizen is subject to the same law, and that law will be enforced by judges evenly and without preference among citizens. The concept was central to our founders when they crafted our Constitution, and also later when additional guarantees such as due process and equal protection of the law was added to the Constitution. So how does a judge who happens also to be a Christian apply the rule of law? Professor Shaw wanted to know. How do you, judge, as a Christian, apply the rule of law? He asked me also, are there unique pressures that occasionally give rise to conflicts for you as both a Christian and a judge? And finally, he asked, as a Christian and a judge, can you remain faithful to God and at the same time uphold your duty that is incumbent upon you to follow the rule of law? The answer to all these questions, I believe, and I submit to you, can be found in the scriptures themselves. For the concept of justice is one that is ancient and universal and has been known to man for a long time. And the Bible itself is filled with themes of justice and judging. In preparation, I went back to my Bible to look at a number of the passages that I hadn't seen for a while. One is very familiar to me, but a number I hadn't seen. To cite a few examples for you in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. God commanded the Israelites to appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. This theme was revisited in 2 Chronicles chapter 19, verses 5 through 10, where Scripture tells us that Jehoshaphat appointed judges in the land in each of the fortified cities of Judah. He told them, consider carefully what you do, because you're not judging for mere mortals, but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Let the fear of the Lord be on you. Judge carefully, for with the Lord our God there is no injustice or partiality or bribery. And then perhaps in the most familiar biblical reference about judges, I turn to Micah chapter 6, verse 8, the Old Testament, where God instructs Micah that those who judge must act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. God's instructions about judging supply the basis for the rule of law. Judging fairly and carefully and without partiality, acting justly, loving mercy, all of these things speak to a singular and a uniform standard of fair judging. And all of them are really subsumed within the concept of equal justice under law. To act justly, as Micah commands, means that a judge must act fairly and impartially and view everyone through the same lens. Considerations of race and creed and color, and yes, even religious beliefs, those of the judge and those of the person being judged, must not be allowed to affect the judgment that's rendered in court. Now, not everyone is confident that Christian judges can walk the fine line that's required. And unfortunately, there have been some instances in which judges have taken action that have heightened these concerns. You may remember Justice Roy Moore of the Alabama Supreme Court. He was instructed by higher courts to remove the 10 Commandments from his public building, and he refused to do so. Finally took an order of the high court for the marshals to go in and remove the 10 Commandments. More recently, in England, an organization has formed that's known as the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, or the LCF. And they have developed a growing presence in the organized bar and in the judiciary of England. One of the stated objectives of this group is, quote, applying God's justice on the ground, end quote. Now, when I read that, I thought to myself, what does that mean? What does it mean, applying God's justice on the ground? And remember, these are judges talking, lawyers. A senior member of the judiciary in England, who happens also to be a senior member of the LCF, answered the question this way. He said, one of the difficulties of being a Christian within the law is that you're administrating a system which doesn't claim to be Christian. And the standards which the law expects of people are much less and rather different from the standards that Christians expect of themselves. Now, I have to tell you, with all respect to Judge Moore and his resistance to the higher authorities and to the mission of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship in England. In my view, this is not what God has directed for judges. It's not what he asks of judges. Like everyone else, we who are judges live in a society where God has placed us. And we have a responsibility to that society to ensure that it works as it's intended to. A Christian judge who submits or substitutes his own religious views in place of the applicable law is not acting justly, as Micah commands, as God directed Micah to act. Not acting justly at all, no more than a Hispanic judge who treats Asian American litigants differently because of their race. Neither one of those things can be reconciled with the concept of rule of law. And as I suggest to you, it's not what God suggested. Judges bring to the bench experience from their lives. Obviously, I've been influenced, as my opening remarks to you foretold, by having attended this wonderful university and sharing beliefs that I think many of you have. So we're informed by those, but God has clearly directed in the Bible that we must act fairly and impartially, which means judging people or causes without preconceptions and without agendas, and not according necessarily to our own religious doctrine. Professor Shaw wanted to know, are there unique pressures on you as a judge and as a Christian that occasionally give rise to conflicts? And I must confess to you the answer to that is yes. Let me describe the one that comes up the most frequently for me. I work in a border district, what we call a border district. The Southern District of California, San Diego, sits on the border with Mexico, and we have lots of crime and lots of criminals. Every week, I sentence between 20 and 30 defendants every Monday morning, and I have to tell you, it's the worst part of my job. I don't know how anyone could enjoy doing that. It's a responsibility, and I'm pledged to carry out my responsibilities, but it's not a pleasant part of the job. The consequences of the sentencing decisions that I make certainly affect the defendants who are sentenced, and it affects their families. Sometimes the consequences affect the victims as well. Professor Shaw mentioned to you that I recently presided in the Tucson case in which the deranged gunman killed 6 people and wounded 13, including a United States Congresswoman, Gabby Giffords. The sentencing hearing in that case came last November, and it was an awful thing to endure for everyone there. In most courtrooms these days, and certainly in federal court, the victims in a crime involving victims are allowed to speak. They're allowed to address the defendant and address the court. I'm sure you've seen it on TV, or maybe you've witnessed it in person. Maybe you've been a victim of a crime. But for 2 hours, I had a steady succession of people that had been wounded or who'd had a loved one killed address the consequences of those actions. Most of them will never get over that. There's no 2-bit word, no 25-cent word like closure that helps them. All the legal system could give them was resolution. At times, they would ask me for permission to direct their comments directly to the defendant who was there in court. He had been medicated and his schizophrenia had been put in check. But the compelling aspect of that was that directly behind him sat his parents, who were good people, unsophisticated but good people, and who struggled with him and with his mental illness to try to keep it in check. And as each successive victim got up and looked back, I could see the grief on his parents' face. It was too much for them at times. They broke down and cried uncontrollably. Suffice it to say, in making sentencing decisions, it's the most profoundly difficult responsibility I have to perform. Now, as I read to you from Micah, God has directed judges to love mercy, and I believe I do. What does it mean to love mercy? Well, I found a partial answer to that question in a definition that is offered by a modern theologian, James F. Keenan. Father Keenan works at Boston University, and he's a prolific author. He explains that mercy means the willingness to to enter into the chaos of another person's life. Mercy is the willingness to enter into the chaos of another person's life. Believe me, I see chaos in the lives of others on a daily basis. Law can be a messy business, and this aspect of it, this sentencing, and some others, I'm sometimes reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help the wounded man after others had bypassed him. Attending to someone in need, especially a criminal defendant or a crime victim, is no simple affair. To defendants and to their families, the concept of mercy often means a reduced jail sentence. But granting that kind of concession can be at odds with the interests of victims. And it can be at odds with other objectives in the criminal justice system, such as retribution and deterrence, protecting the public, and promoting respect for the law. So it's a very difficult balancing act that I, as a judge and as a Christian, go through every time I make a sentencing decision. Let me refer again to a familiar scripture in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 22. All of you have heard this story. Then Peter came to him and said, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times?" And Jesus told him, "I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. I find myself buffeted week to week and month to month and year to year by the question, what is the right sentence? As Christians, we're taught to obey the laws of our society. And I must tell you, growing up in a Christian home and attending a Christian college, I learned that there were consequences for deviating from the rules. I'm a little ashamed to admit this tonight, but when I left NNC in 1974, I was on disciplinary probation. In those days, and maybe this is still the case, but dancing was against the rules. Is that still the case here? No dancing? Yeah, well, that was the rule then. And one night, I slipped out with a young freshman girl, and we cut the rug at a place called the Jolly Knights Lounge. Is that still here? Anyway, we got caught, and I was called into the dean's office, Dean Irving Laird. And I remember how sad Dean Laird seemed when he called me in to inform me of the punishment. Dean Laird liked me, and he'd taken an interest in me. And when he called me in, he almost had tears in his eyes. I remember thinking to myself, well, if you feel so bad about it, why don't we just call the whole thing off? But he didn't. But I still knew how reluctant he was to administer the punishment that was due. I mentioned to you that I had learned lessons here, and I learned a lesson from that experience with Dr. Laird. It was even though as Christians we're called upon to forgive, there is sometimes still a debt to be paid. Just as Dr. Laird was, I'm often conflicted and sad when I'm compelled to impose punishment in cases. But I do it because, just as he did, I recognize that there's a responsibility to the society, whether it's the society of a campus or the larger society of the cities in which we live, that demand a response. Professor Shaw also asked whether I could maintain simultaneous faithfulness to God while upholding the rule of law, this idea that people are to be judged on the same set of rules and fairly and evenly. To the extent that I haven't already answered that, let me again invoke God's last instruction to Micah. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I'm proud to serve as a member of the United States judiciary. It's important and it's an elite job, and I confess to you, I worked hard to earn it. But being a federal judge doesn't completely define me, not even close. Believe it or not, it's not even my most important identity. Before I'm a judge, I'm a husband of 33 years. I'm a father to 2 bright, handsome young men, unmarried. And I'm a Christian. And each of these identities is much more important to me than what I do for a living. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, we as Christians are told that you're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but rather on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. As a Christian who happens to be a judge, it is important for me to pick the right spots to let my light shine. Justice, after all, demands the appearance of justice. And I try to guard against coming off as pious or overtly religious when I sit on the bench, because I think it may lead fairly to a perception by participants or observers that the outcome of the case will depend on my religion. As I've explained, that's not what I believe, and that's not what I practice. Walking humbly with God means keeping one's priorities straight, and it means understanding that faith is individualized and that it's personal, and that we shouldn't attempt to force it on the unwilling, and I don't do that. I have to admit to you that there are occasions when my faith, or at least my background and my upbringing, does spring up in court. I've already mentioned to you my Monday calendars. They're long and they're arduous, and they sometimes go on for hours. And at the end of a long calendar, when the last case is called and the lawyer who's been waiting so patiently comes to plead his case, I'll frequently acknowledge his patience and thank him for being so patient. And I've been known to say, and if you were in my faith, you'd take special heed that in the next life, the first will be last and the last will be first. I mentioned to somebody today during an interview, they said there are other occasions when it came up. I had a nearly hysterical defendant once, and his lawyer couldn't control him. He wanted to read something he'd written. He'd written this long diatribe, and he wanted to read it to me, and I was trying to be respectful and patient, even though this was a lot of gibberish. At one point, he got into biblical references, and he was in tears. He was so upset about this. I think he had a screw loose. And he said, I know this is not meaningful to you, Judge. I know you don't understand this. And I said, oh, but I do. I said, you're reading from the Beatitudes. And he said, you're a believer. And I said, yes, I am. And it had all the difference in the world. He calmed down. It was like pouring cold water on this fellow that he thought he was being understood. To me, the idea of walking humbly with God means treating people who appear before me, whatever evil thing they may have done, with dignity and with the respect that Jesus showed to the many sinners that he encountered. A few years ago, I handled a drug cartel case. We had a terrible problem with a cartel known as the Arellano Felix cartel along the Mexican border. They were ruthless, billions of dollars probably in drug proceeds. They killed many people. They were responsible for just about every form of evil that plagued us, kidnappings and the like. The leader of that cartel was caught by our Coast Guard off of the coast of Mexico. They had put a beeper on a boat that he used, and they were laying in wait for him when he drifted slightly into international waters. And he was brought to San Diego. It was a big thing. There was our main street was shut down, and he was brought to the jail where he remained throughout the proceedings. He pled guilty eventually, and as part of his guilty plea, he admitted to participation in 19 murders. 19 people that he'd either commissioned the murder or participated in the murder. I won't tell you all of the details, but some of the murders were just horrific. Application of blowtorches to people and just unthinkable things that one human being might do to another. Now, I find it very difficult in situations like that to find common ground with a defendant, but when I do face a situation like that, I remember back to the way Christ dealt with so many different sinners that he encountered, always with kindness, always with respect and dignity. And I tried to do that. I try to do that in my approach to everyone who appears in front of me. I sentenced Javier Ariano Felix to life without parole in a federal prison. He's now in a deep hole in Colorado. They have a maximum security prison there that's bored into a mountainside, and he's in the back in one of those cells by himself. He's incarcerated 23 hours a day. He gets out for an hour for some exercise. He gave one interview after he was sentenced, and in that interview he didn't want to talk about much else but this. He made it a point to tell the reporter that he appreciated the way that the judge had treated him during the process. So again, I invoke the words of Micah, act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Those are all the directives I need to reconcile the Christian faith I have with the responsibilities I have as a public judge, a judge in a secular society. I want to thank you again for being here tonight. These are the remarks that I had. I hope they responded to the questions that you put. I think it's contemplated that you may have some questions. If you do, I'll be happy to answer. One of the constraints that I have is that I can't speak about pending cases. I was able to tell you about a couple of cases that I've been involved in because those cases are completed now. They're done. But one of the rules for judges is they can't talk about pending cases. And I'll tell you why I say that. I have another case with a cross and a memorial down in San Diego, and it has had some national attention. Atheists have sued to have this cross taken down. It's been there for 58 years. And that case is pending in front of me still. I ruled that it could not come down, did not have to come down, and was overruled by the Ninth Circuit, but it's gone to the Supreme Court, and it's back with me now, so it's still pending. So I can't, other than to describe the stature of the case and the stage that it's at, I can't talk about it, but I'll try to answer your questions subject to that constraint in the best way I can. Do you have any for me?
Dr. Shaw, I think if somebody wants to remain somewhat anonymous or don't want to really stand with a question, Judge Burns has been so kind. He says,
"Hey, I don't want you looking at questions ahead of time. I'll take anything. He said, if I don't have an answer for you, then I won't answer it. But if anybody wants the mic, I have the mic here. But if you'd rather turn in one of those slips we gave you as you entered, and give that to April here, or Liz over there, and Dr. Shaw can handle it that way. So, but let's just keep this moving. And anyone that has a question, who's the brave first so here? Yeah, one over there, sir. Okay, I'll come to you.
The announcement that I was given indicated that you would be talking about the beliefs that you have forged about gun reform as a result of the case in Tucson.
Sure.
You didn't mention it in your presentation.
No,
Could you address that a little bit?
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. I mentioned to you that I sentenced Jared Loeffner, who was the Tucson shooter. At that time, it was one of the worst mass shootings in the history of the country. Not the worst, but one of the worst. It's a terrible indictment, I think, of our country, that since that time we've already had 3 other shootings that have resulted in more deaths and more people being wounded. In the course of that case, my thoughts about guns and Second Amendments and what should be allowed and what's not allowed began to crystallize to some extent. Now, let me be clear about this. I'm a conservative judge. I was appointed by a conservative president. A couple years ago, the Supreme Court determined that we have a constitutional right to have firearms to protect ourselves, and I agree wholeheartedly with that ruling. I think they got it right. In my own personal life, as you can imagine, handling the kinds of cases that I handle, I take precautions. I have a gate at my house. I have security cameras and alarm system. I also have 6 handguns, and I have them strategically placed at different parts around my house. My wife and I have a plan that if anybody ever comes, if we ever have a break-in, what we'll do. And it involves getting to these guns strategically placed. With all that said, let me tell you how my views began to change as I was involved in the Loeffner case. Jared Loeffner had a magazine, one of those that sticks out from the butt of the pistol that he had, a Glock pistol. And that magazine held 31 rounds, and he was able to fire all of those rounds plus one in the chamber. He fired 32 rounds. 19 people were injured and killed, 6 killed, 13 wounded. I mentioned to you that during the sentencing, I heard from many of the victims. One of the women courageously barricaded her child between herself and the wall and was shot in the back 3 times. They were able to take 2 of the rounds out of her, but one was so close to her spine that they couldn't, and she walks in a crippled fashion now because of that. And there are a dozen other compelling stories that I could tell you. A 9-year-old girl shot to death. The chief judge, who was a wonderful man, Christian man, was there to thank the congresswoman for helping him with a judge bill, and he was shot to death. Never knew that day when he got up and went to mass that morning that that would be his fate. But I began to think about the implications of that. Jared Loeffner was only stopped because while he was trying to change these monster magazines in this gun, someone ran up and hit him with a chair, and he dropped one of the magazines, and somebody put their foot on it, and they were able to stop the carnage at that point. And I thought to myself, my goodness, you know, we weren't going to talk him out of this. He was a deranged fellow after all. But one of the implications was, what if he'd had a 10-round magazine? It seems to me, just as a matter of statistics, that the carnage that day would have been greatly reduced. It would have been mitigated to a great extent, maybe 2 killed, maybe 4 wounded, not 6 and 13. And then I started to think about why we have such things. Why do we have these big magazines like that? Well, my wife and I watched a program, popular movie that's just come out, Zero Dark 30. Have you seen that movie about the raid on bin Laden's compound? Now, I'd need a 30-round magazine if I'm going to be on that helicopter heading toward this unknown compound with unknown people in it. And I might need it in some other circumstances that don't readily come to mind now, but I'll tell you when I don't need it. I don't need it as a citizen. I don't. I have lots of friends who are hunters, and they say, you know, there's never a herd of 30 of anything that charges at once. And sportsmen, the guys that shoot in sports competitions, as I understand, I don't do that, but as I understand it, part of the competition is reloading the gun in the allotted amount of time. It's usually based on time and accuracy. So they say we don't need 30-round magazines. This fellow in Colorado, whose case is apparently going forward, we didn't call what he had a magazine. It held 100 bullets. We called it a drum. And so I started to think, pardon me, even before that sentencing, what's the social utility in all this? I mean, what good does it do for us? Now, my friends, and most of them don't agree with me on this. I frankly think we ought not to have those magazines in civilian hands. I think large capacity magazines like that don't serve any useful purpose, and they do a lot of harm. I have to tell you, 90% of my friends disagree with me, and this is such a hot button issue. It surpasses abortion or any other, issue that you could raise at this point. And my friends usually say, well, look, we build bridges knowing people are going to jump off of them. What's the difference? Now, I can make the case for the bridge that spans Coronado Island to San Diego. It's got thousands of commuters a day who get to work and rely on it. And I've been told, well, we lay train track. We continue to lay train track knowing people are going to jump in front of trains. But I can make the case for trains. All the coal comes out of eastern Pennsylvania. There's social utility in that. What I can't do is make the case for a large capacity magazine in the hands of a civilian. I don't know what good comes of that. The constitutional scholars will tell you, well, the origin of this right to bear arms was the necessity of us to form militias in case the government goes corrupt on us, in case they become tyrants, and then we can fight them. Think about that for a minute in terms of modern day events. How well are the resistance fighters in Syria doing with large capacity magazines on their AK-47s? They roll the tanks in, they roll the armored vehicles in, they're helpless against those. If we had such an insurrection in this country again, they'd drone us. our large capacity magazines, our drums wouldn't be worth anything. So the romantic notion of, exchanging musket balls with guys in red coats, that may have worked in 1776. I don't think it's a justification for that now. So the reason I think that maybe got billing is that after I sentenced Jared Lofter, I was still ruminating about this. It still bothered me. And then I woke up one morning in December and I saw all of these beautiful young children that had been killed by this crazy guy in Newtown, Connecticut. And I thought to myself, the predictable voices will be those that always call for gun reform, the people that want to take every gun from everybody. Those will be the predictable voices here. Maybe it's time for a less predictable voice to speak out on this. Somebody who happens to be conservative, happens to be a gun owner, is not necessarily against the aims of the NRA. And so I wrote an opinion piece for the LA Times that was widely disseminated. And for a while, I was a champion of a very ironic group. All the libs thought I was the greatest thing in the world. I think I've gone back to my former stature by now. But anyway, those are my thoughts on that. I said in this opinion piece that it was a shame that the assault weapons ban that had been passed by Congress in 1994 was allowed to lapse in 2004. It wasn't very effective, but it was something. At a minimum, it was symbolic. And I think now, although I've watched the newspapers, there's no popular support for this, there's no support in Congress, I think now that Congress ought to pass new gun legislation and ought to forbid the possession of large capacity magazines. To me, those are in the category of machine guns and bazookas and things that citizens have no need for. I know that's a controversial point of view, and this is one area where I think if I got a case like this in front of me challenging some new gun law that was restrictive, I probably would have to give the case up because I have such strong feelings about it. So I don't want you to be confused about what I said about keeping my religion to myself.
As a follow-up, it would seem to me from what you said, as I understand, Thomas Jefferson felt strongly that the government should fear the people more than the people should fear the government. And from what you said, it appears to me that you would not agree that the government should fear the people because the citizenry shouldn't be allowed to have any kind of armament that would give them any kind of a threat.
Well, it's just how you define threat, I suppose. As I said, I'm dealing with some of the most heartless, vicious people that I can imagine. I mean, as I mentioned to you, a guy that had personally been involved in 19 murders. I, in my private moments, have concern for my safety and my wife's safety. There's only the two of us in our house now. So I'm not immune to that. I'm not immune to the need to protect myself, but I think I can do it just fine with the weapons that are conventional and available to me. I mean, I have some revolvers. I have some that take a magazine with 10 shots and another one in the chamber makes 11. I can't imagine that if a gunfight broke out in my house with an intruder, somebody wouldn't be shot in the first 22 shots. I mean, either me or him or both of us. So, no, my view is not that we should disarm the citizenry or that we should prevent the citizens from having weapons to protect themselves. But I do think that the idea that we could arm citizens in such a way that if the government ever did turn, if the government ever did become tyrannical, that it would be effective, we can't do that. We just can't do that. As long as there are drones and munitions and tanks and those things, then no amount of small arms are going to be effective against those. But, these are just personal views of mine. They arise out of these tragedies. My concentration was more on the scope of what has happened in these mass shootings and maybe taking the mass out of mass shootings. That's what I hope we can do at some point. Okay. Sure.
Your Honor, I appreciate what you said. I actually grew up by Columbine, so I was in high school when Columbine happened. Question to you is, and more for maybe the students and also for myself since I'm a younger attorney. I heard a very sad statistic that being an associate attorney is now the most depressing job in America. A study came out and it's exceeded pretty much all the other jobs, including dentistry, which used to be the bad one. I was wondering,
you say being
an associate attorney,
Associate.
an associate attorney in a law firm, which a lot of us do. So the question is, practicing law in what we have now with also being a Christian, how do you manage both? And maybe being a Christian will help those students or people actually be able to cope with necessarily the rigors of being a lawyer.
The frustrations, as I understand them these days, is that there's just not enough work. As the economy has tanked and businesses tanked, law firms that depend on businesses to do their legal work and to pay their bills just have not been enough to give to the associates, and that's one of the big sources, I think, of frustration. I know, too, from my days as a young lawyer that you don't get the plum assignments. You do the document review and many tasks that some would consider clerical. I don't know that I have good advice for you. I'll tell you this, in my career, we've had down cycles in the law. There have been other ones. I don't know that there's ever been one as bad as this one. But there have been cycles, and it always comes back. And I think if you, I don't want to sound platitudinous about this, but I think if you stay positive and you continue to build your reputation and your work ethic, and it's known to others, that there'll be a time for you. There'll be a time when the practice of law becomes much more satisfactory. Josh was with us tonight. He applied to 12 law schools, and he got into 12. Where is he? Yeah, here you go. Yeah, congratulations. And he was asking me earlier, kind of a variation of the question you asked. So what's important for me to know as I embark on this career? And a pivotal piece of advice I gave him was that his reputation is everything. That is true in a lot of professions, but it's particularly true in the law. After the first year, no one asks you where you went to law school anymore. You make your bones on your reputation, whether you're honest, a person of integrity, a person that deals fairly with other people, whether you're effective and a hard worker. So I would say, stay the course, keep doing what you've been doing that's gotten to where you've gotten. Things will change, the circumstances will change. I was always very persistent, and I had setbacks along the way. But I remained persistent, not always positive. I mean, I had blue moments, down moments, but I think if you stay persistent, you believe in yourself, you have confidence in yourself and your abilities, that your perception about the difficulties will gradually brighten. I had a couple of questions here. One is, have I seen a change in society in relation to strong spiritual communities and crime? Sure, yeah, I have. Look, it's most pronounced in the drug area. We had 2 states in the last election cycle that said, we're going to let people smoke marijuana if they want. Washington State, I understand you can do that now, and Colorado. So, yes, but public perceptions are changing with respect to things. I think the statistics on homosexual marriage have changed radically in the last 10 years. I come from a state where, 7 years ago, I think we voted and we decided we wanted to keep marriage traditional as it had been. All of the available data now suggests that the thinking on that issue has completely changed, and if it were up to a vote again, it would go the other way. So yes, I have seen changes in society, and I think some of those have, a spiritual dimension to them. Certainly, those things are kind of outside the realm for me. If I had been in Washington, I would not have voted to legalize marijuana, for example. Do I think it's the worst thing in the world? No, I don't. I was asked a couple years ago, I went to a Christmas party in my old neighborhood, and my neighbors had all gotten much younger, which is one of the reasons I moved out. And they said, well, Judge, what do you think? We're having this debate. Is marijuana a gateway drug? Does it lead to other drugs? And frankly, I don't know how to answer that in terms of physiology. I don't know that there's any data that suggests that one could get a dependency on a certain type of drug and that would lead him to the other. But I'll tell you this. in every case I've seen with more serious drugs, and I handle cases where people have and are trying to sell 80 pounds of methamphetamine or 25 pounds of heroin. In every one of those cases, the gateway was somebody started with marijuana trafficking. They don't go right into the hard drug trafficking. They start with marijuana trafficking. And my instincts tell me that if I'm a marijuana user and I want to go to something else, that I go to my marijuana dealer and say, well, I'm interested in this. And so my answer to my young neighbors, former neighbors, was that it's a gateway in my judgment in that sense. You're in a culture, you're dealing with people that think using some form of drug is okay, and they probably think that using other forms of drugs are okay. So yeah, I think there has been a change in society. I've seen it in my lifetime. I think we have become much more tolerant of a lot of things that we weren't very tolerant about before. What made me decide to get involved in law? My dad was a policeman. My dad was a Pasadena police officer. And, you know, the lessons that we get as little kids. I remember going down occasionally. My mom would take me down when my dad had a case in court. And we'd sit in the courtroom and watch when he had to testify. And he was always so proud to be associated with the prosecutors. My dad got pulled out of school in the 7th grade. He never had a formal education. He's not a dumb man. He's just not an educated man. And I remember as a kid just watching the adulation he had for these prosecutors. And I think, you know, somewhere along the line we all want to please our parents. We want to do things that are pleasing to our parents. I think that's what my initial instinct was. I have a sister who's a prosecutor now in Los Angeles. She's been a prosecutor for 23 years, and she tells the same story. She has similar experiences of seeing my dad's appreciation. It's been a wonderful profession for me. Sometimes, you know, you get right where you're supposed to be, right in the job you're supposed to have. This is it for me. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as a lawyer, and I enjoy it now as a judge. And the things I told you at the beginning of my remarks were really, really true. I had a speech teacher here named Marilyn Thompson, and she was a wonderful speech teacher. You know, you get here, you're a little green, you're a little embarrassed, and she had people up on their feet, and you'd walk in one day and she'd give you a subject, and she said, 5 minutes from now you're going to be making a speech on this. And you really went through the gauntlet in her class. I came out of here and out of Nazarene College able to make a speech, not feeling the butterflies that are so common with you know, young lawyers or people addressing a group for the first time. So you know, partly I would say it was my own personality and my own instincts, and then partly the influence of my dad that got me interested in law. Next question. Recently, there are 2 shootings of district attorneys in Kaufman, Texas. There have been other shootings of lawyers and judges over the years. Does this have an effect on the way that you sentence people? It doesn't, not in any direct sense. Something's going on down there, I think, in Texas. I think this is the 2 prosecutors in the same office, and the early read on that is that it's a white supremacy group. They've denied it, but that they're retaliating for something that these district attorneys did. These cases don't have an effect on me directly. They don't. Now, having said that, there are certain things that do. It's not safe to go into Mexico anymore. I don't know if any of you have traveled to Mexico, but people that come down and visit me in San Diego and say, oh, we want to go across the border to Tijuana, I always advise against that. And one of the reasons it's not safe is that the drug organizations have now resorted to kidnapping Americans and holding them for ransom. We have had just a huge upsurge in that. I think the FBI statistics from last year were that there were 600 or 700 kidnappings, they estimated. Only a fraction of those get reported because the organizations tell these people, if you call the police, we'll kill your relative. And so there are many, many payoffs. I know of 2 instances that our United States Marshal Service have told us about where the Mexicans have actually come into the United States and they kidnapped golfers at a country club nearby the border, figuring that these are people of means and somebody will pay handsomely to get them back. Obviously, that is something that I think about often. I live down there. They tell us don't even go by the border. Don't put yourself in a situation like that. So fast forward. I was sentencing a fellow on a drug and gun case. He was up here from Mexico selling drugs and guns. A little 16-year-old girl was kidnapped off the street and taken to Mexico around the time that this guy's sentencing was scheduled. And her parents were frantic, as you can expect. They'd gotten a call demanding a ransom. They didn't have the money to pay the ransom, so they did get the FBI involved. And fortuitously, the FBI had been tapping this guy's phone in connection with the gun sales and the drug sales, and they began to hear conversations about what do we do with her, where do we take her, and they put two and two together and realized that this guy was also directing the kidnappings. And so when that became clear, they gathered from the information they were hearing on the wiretap the location of the little girl, and assisted by the Mexican police, they were able to rescue her. She'd been put in a closet, duct taped, held in that closet for 3 days. No food, no water. She defecated on herself. And an experience, obviously, she'll never, ever get out of her mind. Well, they linked this fellow to it. He was a relatively young man, 28 or 29. And when the case came in front of me, the prosecutor, of course, asked for a long sentence, and the defense did what they're supposed to do. They concentrated on things that were maybe not as aggravated about this fellow, his age, the fact that he had family and this and that. And I listened, and I have to tell you, I didn't listen with the same degree of intent that I would in the ordinary case. I think that problem is so bad, and it's so seldom that we actually get somebody that's involved in directing a thing like that, that was a case, unlike these, where I really did have a visceral and an emotional reaction. I gave him a long sentence. He's 28 or 29, and I think I imposed a 30-year sentence. My attitude was, for that type of thing, once is too often. Once is too often. So, look, I'm aware of these things going on. It makes me a little. Why did you bring this up? My wife is home alone, and I'm here, so I. Sure. Okay. There's an argument that people who want to do bad things, mass killings, for example, will find the means to do them, even if assault rifles or 100-round magazines are banned, especially in a place like San Diego, where there's drug cartels illegally obtaining weapons. Those kind of crimes will still be committed. How do you respond to that argument defending Second Amendment rights? I can't refute that argument. I agree with you. Look, there is sin and there is evil in the world, and there has been and there always will be. And there are deranged people, and these types of things go on. But I think we have to do something. And I'm talking about more than just cosmetics or symbolism. In the article that opinion piece that I wrote, I had a radical suggestion, which is that Congress ban these big magazines. Now, the estimates are that there's hundreds of thousands of them out there. Well, you don't have to confiscate them from people, but you could pass a federal law, for example, that said if the game wardens catch you with more than 10 rounds in the magazine, regardless of how many rounds your magazine will hold, that's a federal offense. So don't put a bunch of bullets in your magazine. My sense of things, and my sense of economics, is that pretty soon the magazines aren't going to be worth as much. Pretty soon there's not going to be the clamor to get them. I know what happened in the aftermath of these shootings and the talk of gun reform. All these things came off the shelves. I have a friend, a fellow judge who's a hunter, and he told me he made his way to South Dakota. He stopped at Cabela's along the way, and the only thing there was on the shelf was shotgun shells, no other form of ammunition. So I know, I believe that there's an economic element to this, and that in response to public policy, the economics move one way or the other. This is not my suggestion's not a panacea. I don't have any illusion that if we pass such laws that tomorrow we won't have another mass shooting in the United States. But I think we have to start down that path, and we have to make it more difficult for these things to be obtained. If they're illegal, I assume that there are a number of people that have them that would turn them in, that would get rid of them. I assume that. Years ago, we said no more Freon. You have to find a different way to get your air conditioner chilled. And there was a bit of a stir at the time. A lot of people said, well, we got all these canisters of Freon. What do we do with them? And government's response was, well, that's your problem. And I'm told that was for the good. I'm told that the Freon was putting a hole in our ozone layer, and that there were other products that wouldn't do that, keep our cars cool. This is a long-term solution, what I advocate here. There will always be demented people. There will always be shootings like that. But as I said, I think it's incumbent upon us as a responsible society, people that care about each other, to take some steps that might take the mass element out of these mass shootings. Do you believe that judicial activism is a growing problem today, and how can it be addressed? Yeah, I think it is a problem. You know, I mentioned to you that we're all informed by our experiences. And, you know, some of these rules, this rule of law and treating people the same and judging cases by the same standards, those are great things to say without any context. But when you start to put context to them, you know, maybe it becomes a little more nuanced. Maybe a judge's views are really his own. I'll tell you what I do to try to guard against that in my own court. Over the years, I'm allowed to have 2 law clerks. I hire bright young people out of law school, and I have always made it a point to try to hire somebody that doesn't necessarily share my ideology. I have one law clerk now who's a devout Christian. The other is an atheist. And I think it helps me, helps remind me at least of what my responsibility is. This judge fairly part of it, not impose religious beliefs on others. I understand this question's broader than that. It's not just about religious beliefs, it's about activism in general. I think it's a bad thing for the courts to be involved in too many of the social issues. I hope that they kick both of these marriage cases and don't get involved. I hope they leave it to citizens to decide these things. It's working. You know, slowly but surely progress is being made. Either states are saying, no, we don't want it, or we do want it, and that's the way democracy is supposed to work. We're not supposed to have a judge that tells people the way it's going to be. That was never, if that had been suggested at the Constitutional Convention, they'd have run for the exits. No one would have ratified a constitution that provided that kind of power to one branch of government. I was bothered a few years ago by the Guantanamo cases. Here are enemy combatants. They're taken prisoner on foreign battlefields. They're brought to a place outside the United States. They've never stepped foot here. Now, yeah, it's a property over which we have control. It's a place over which we have control. But these things are all done pursuant to the president's power as commander-in-chief. He runs wars. He makes decisions about wars. He's the guy that signed off on the mission to go get bin Laden. And that's because he gets the best advice on those things. He gets advice from people who are in the know about military matters. I wasn't in the military. I had a lottery number in 1972, but fortunately it was high enough and Vietnam was dying down. But there's nothing in my background or my portfolio that allows me to know how they should interrogate enemy combatants in Guantanamo. I really thought it was inappropriate for judges to butt into that. Had I been on the Supreme Court, I would have said, none of our business. This is President Obama's call. This is President Bush's call. These are enemy combatants, and the Constitution gives the president as commander-in-chief war powers authority, not judges. So, you know, my view is, and this is an interesting question because as you can imagine, when I went through the vetting process, I think President Bush was one that thought we had too many judicial activists, and this is something they screened for. They wanted to know your views on these things. How expansive are you going to be based on your own experiences and your own viewpoint? And as you can imagine, I think the judiciary ought to do less, not more, on these things. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir. I'm an alum here from NNU. I am a retired military member. It was interesting to me in the discussion that has already come up regarding a number of different things. An incident that happened to me shortly after I had come back from serving overseas in Germany, sitting nuclear alert, that a discussion came up about weapons from airplanes and how that nuclear weapons were immoral. And at the end of that discussion, I said, does that mean that then that because I have set nuclear alert, that I am also immoral? And the discussion ended. Happened to be a Sunday school class. It was time to go to church.
Yeah.
There wasn't much of an answer after that. I don't think anybody wanted to basically sit judge and jury over whether or not I was moral or immoral. Yeah. Some of you may have that opinion already of me, but I sat also in Dr. Shaw's class, and he isn't going to like me for what I'm about to say, because except it's his fault. He posed a question to you: how can you be a Christian and a judge? I would like to turn that question around. Again, this is where it's his fault, because I learned it from him. My question is more, in America, knowing what our foundational principles are based upon, how can one not be a Christian and judge? How is it possible that based upon what our laws are based upon, or at least my understanding of what our laws are based upon, that you can judge fairly without being a Christian? And in addition to that, recently, a professor from Cal State University, San Bernardino, Edward Erler, has given a talk on natural law, first principles, and I'm going to dovetail those together with what you call the rule of law. Would you please expand and expound upon first principles, natural law, and the rule of law? From whence do they come?
You got it in the biography. I graduated from law school like over 30 years ago, right? The concept of natural law is that there is a set of rights that are endowed to us just by virtue of our being, that we get those from a creator. It doesn't take a government to give us those or to restrict those. We're not enabled by a government. And so the natural law principle is that there are certain rights that we call inalienable. They can't be forfeited. They can't be taken away by anybody. And there is a fierce debate in the legal community these days over whether the natural law principles ought to be given more play in judicial determinations. So often we look to the legislature and we say, well, what was the legislative intent here? What did they say when they were debating this? There's a great debate over that, how much attention we pay to what individual legislators said while a law was being debated and before it was enacted. But there's tension between those things. There are those, and they tend to be people that have libertarian views that look at it doesn't take a government to give us these rights. We're born with these things. We have a right of self-determination in many, many areas. And only to the extent that we start to exercise those rights in ways that affect others is it maybe legitimate for a government to get involved and legislate. That tension goes on at a much higher level than mine. It's a tension that usually the appellate courts address. I tell juries when they come in, look, there are laws that I enforce that I don't agree with. But that's not my station in this whole process to impose my own will or what I think the law ought to be. We'll have chaos. We'll have absolute chaos if each individual judge decides things or causes things to be decided based on an individual perspective. So while I understand the argument about natural law, it has its limitations, as you can imagine. What would we do? We do if the quality of justice were not the same in Boise as it is in San Diego, if the rules were different for you than they are for me down there. That's not to say we're without recourse. If we don't like a law, we vote against it. We vote to replace the person that voted for it. We urge legal reform. This whole thing about gay marriage has come about as a result of that. People dissatisfied with the fact that they can't marry one another, same gender, and they've I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but they've agitated and they've brought that issue to the fore, and they've caused votes and they've caused courts to get involved. And I actually think that's the way the process ought to work, ought to play out. I don't know if that answers your question completely. I disagree, by the way, with the guy that called you immoral because you had something to do with our nuclear protections. There's an old judge who sits on our court. He's 88 now, 88, senior judge. And he was a military officer in World War II. He's told me this story. And he participated in the invasion of Okinawa. And if the invasion of the other Japanese islands had occurred, he was going to lead a group there. He's not active anymore as a judge. He comes to our meetings. He has a voice, but he doesn't hear cases anymore. What he does instead is he audits classes at the University of California, San Diego, and he just finished a World War II class. And I'll tell you what the sentiment was in his class. They got to the decision of President Truman to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there was a low rumble that went through the classroom of mostly 18 to 22-year-olds. And the consensus among this group was that that was a war crime and that Harry Truman should be regarded as a war criminal. The young PhD teaching this class, I think, was in his 40s, and at the end, after everyone had had their say, he turned to this judge, now 88. And he said, "I suspect you have a different perspective on this. You've lived this." And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." He said, "You know, the estimates at the time, it came from a commission that first President Roosevelt and then President Hoover relied on, was that we would lose 500,000 people in the invasion of Japan, 500,000 Americans, and I think millions of Japanese were projected to be killed." He said, "I'm 88 years old. I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and it's a fair bet that they wouldn't be here today had he not decided to drop those bombs." And again, this low moan went through the class, and class ended. And he says, as he was gathering up his things to leave, the professor came to his desk and said, you know the enemy of the historian? The eyewitness. So keep that in mind. You were there. You know what you were doing. You know the importance of what you're doing. No one has the right to judge the morality of that except you. That'd be my answer to that. Anyone else?
Darrell has asked me to tell you to stop.
Okay.
No, those are his words.
Yeah,
Those are his words, not mine.
overruled. Next question. Thank you very much for having me.
Judge Burns, thank you again for coming. On behalf of NNU, I'd like to thank you for coming and for you guys coming out tonight. We were discussing at dinner briefly that I think there are just a little fewer than 700 federal district court judges in the country. And as far as we know, only one of them attended NNU. Only one of them has a Nazarene College degree, and we're awfully grateful that he took the time out of his busy schedule to come tonight. At one point we said, what's your speaker's fee? And I think I still have the email where he said, it's nothing. He said, it's my privilege to come back. He specifically asked that Saga Dick come because he said, I worked in Saga with him. I'd never met Judge Burns until just a few hours ago. And I feel like I have a lifelong friend. Just an extraordinarily pleasant, engaging gentleman who I hope I never wind up in his court. We are having a reception for Judge Burns in the Dillabaugh Suite in the Johnson Sports Center. As soon as we all get down there, you're all welcome to attend. And if you have any questions, perhaps there'll be a time as well to ask some. But I want to thank you all again for coming out, and good evening.